Dear colleagues, please take your seat. Maybe we can stop the music. Thank you. So before we start with this first session, dear ladies and gentlemen, I would ask you please stand up for a minute of silence for remembrance and tribute to the victims of terrorism. Please let us honor those whose voices we want to bring to the fore today. Voices and stories of victims of terrorism. Thank you very much. Merci. Shukran. Dear Nadia, Ghulam, Taskir, dear Yusuf Hassan, Abdi, Mrs. Pramila Patton, and dear David Elamos from UNOCD and dear Nikolai West from UNODC. For several years now, the IPU and UN have been engaged in raising awareness of the needs of victims of terrorism, not least through the joint IPU, UNODC and UNOCD program on the role of the parliaments in addressing terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. Nowadays, more and more countries are affected by terrorism, especially in the Arab region. But also we in Austria had last year a terrorist attack, and people lost their life because of this attack. And there is a huge number of victims. And here, as representatives of the people, parliamentarians are crucial in supporting victims of terrorism by adopting relevant legislation, allocating budgets to programs supporting victims, and advocating for the voices of their constituents. Parliamentarians are also translate international commitments on victims of terrorism into local realities. And first and foremost, thank you very much for taking the time to attend this session on the first Global Parliamentary Summit on Countering Terrorism. Your valuable insights will reach a broad audience today. Speakers and members of parliament, experts from around the world, observers and important partners in the fight against terrorism and violent extremism are here. And I am grateful about the major interest in today's event. It is from utmost importance for us to listen to you, to understand what you have faced and been through in order to address the needs and rights of those affected by terrorism and to develop the right measures for prevention, short-term actions and long-term responses. Activists, brave people like you have a central role in supporting international partners to develop the right tools, ensuring the effective investigation of terrorist cases, as well as guaranteeing visibility. Today, you will be seen and heard by us all And this should be only a first step on a long way, establishing a global network of parliamentarians to counter terrorism and violent extremism. But first, we will start with some victims who, for different reasons, could not be available to be here today with us. But they send us a video message, which we are going to share with you. The first one is a young victim of terrorism from Nigeria, a survivor. His name is Imrama Buba. I had the chance to meet him in Niger 1 year ago.
My name is Imrana Alhaji Buba. I am from Yobe State in northeastern Nigeria, hotspot of the Boko Haram insurgency. In 2010, I survived a deadly Boko Haram attack. My two uncles died in a bomb blast. My neighbor was murdered, and one of my friends was kidnapped. I also came across many girls and young women that were kidnapped and raped by Boko Haram. These are only a few instances of how Boko Haram terrorists attack and terrorize Nigerian people. Boko Haram's rampage across poverty-stricken northeastern Nigeria is believed to have claimed at least 20,000 lives and displaced more than 2.6 million people, with thousands of victims living in internally displaced persons camps. These horrific situations fueled my desire to counter extremism and support victims. In August 2010, I founded the Youth Coalition Against Terrorism (YOCAT), a volunteer-based coalition of over 600 youth that offers counseling services to victims of terrorism, as well as providing counter-radical peace education and skills training for unemployed youth in Nigeria. Despite our little efforts and that of some government agencies and humanitarian organizations, thousands of victims are yet to be given proper attention and sufficient care. Many victims of terrorism in Nigeria stay in IDP camps where they live in crowded conditions with limited access to water and where healthcare facilities are at low capacity. The arrival of COVID-19 is also exacerbating the situation of many victims in the region. With social distancing and quarantine as the common strategies in slowing the spread of the virus, it is virtually impossible in tight, cramped, and usually unsanitary conditions of most camps. This means many victims are at heightened risk of contracting the COVID-19. Some of the victims and survivors that I spoke with complain about severe emotional trauma. The few face-to-face psychosocial support services that are available in Maiduguri and other cities have been limited by physical restrictions, reducing the resources available for victims. This is why it is very important to pay attention to victims. National government and the UN entities need to garner support of the private sector, international organizations, and foundations to support victims of terrorism. More than ever, it is crucial to provide victims of terrorism with access to not only doctors and nurses, but also psychologists, mental health experts, and counselors to help stem the tide of mental health challenges now and after the COVID-19. Supporting victims and their families is a moral imperative based on promoting, protecting, and respecting their human rights. The more we fail to provide for their needs, lead to the erosion of their resilience, which undermines the sustainability and inclusivity of our countries and communities. Finally, we should raise up voices of victims in countering the appeal of terrorism. To support victims and to listen to their voices is a meaningful way for us to prove that we care and to negate the terrorists. These credible voices unite our community against violence, and I believe that hearing our voices can help in countering this global menace. Thank you.
Buba said it's a moral imperative to support victims of terrorism, and he is right. Yesterday, I had the chance to talk with you, Nadia. Nadia was born in Kabul. She lives now in Spain, a young Afghan woman, a leader of an inspiring NGO called Bridges for Peace, which is so important, not only for Afghanistan. An activist, an author, for me a role model of a courageous and strong personality. I am happy that we have you here and that we have the chance to listen to you. The floor is yours, Nadia. Please.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share my story. Before everything, I would like to share a little bit why I'm here and why I want to share my story. Well, my name is Nadia Ghulam. I born in Afghanistan, in Kabul, and now currently I'm living in Barcelona. My journey to Barcelona was not easy. It is full of difficulties that it is hard to share today with you in a short time I have with you. I born in Afghanistan and I grew up till 21 years old. I was living in Kabul city. When I was a small child, I learned to say my first words. My mother was asking me, Nadia, you are a child. Please ask God to bring peace in our country. I didn't know what was peace meant, but for breakfast, lunch, dinner, I was praying for peace, and adults in my family was very happy. Bravo, Nadia, you are doing very well. Till I became 8 years old. One night, normal night, we had elder guests in my home. Afghanistan is very traditional to serve after dinner, lunch, tea. So my mom went to the kitchen to prepare some tea. I was 8 years old girl. I was very, very curious, and I wanted to discover where my mother is hiding the sweets that she's serving with the tea. When I follow her, she saw me, and she said, no, Nadia, no. Sit here in this room. I will bring you sweets, and I will give you. I was waiting my mother in that room, that suddenly a bomb fell exactly in the room where I was. I burned badly with that bomb, and I had a lot of injuries that I ended up 6 months in coma and during 2 years in different hospitals in my country. We was not safe even in hospital. Me and my family, we fled from the city to a refugee camp next to border of Pakistan, which is called Jalalabad, and we was in refugee camp for 2 years. In that moment, the Taliban regime, like today, was established in my country, and my country was suffering from civil war and also the insurgency of Taliban regime. When I was in refugee camp, the only dream I had is get education and go to school. Today, it's an honor for me to be here and share this story with you, because as a child, with all my injuries, I was looking forward and saying to other children, hey, look, the blue cars, the blue trucks are mine. And one day, I can go there and I explain, stop creating bombs and rockets which take life of children like me. The only things I wanted as a refugee to get education. Of course, they create for us a school in the desert without water, without a floor that clothes us from the hot sun there was shining on us. My dream was not that school. My dream was a school like your children are going in that school. I want a normal school for all refugee children, all people who are suffering from war. If we want to prevent the the terrorist attack and all these things, we have to give power and opportunity for the children, for young generation, because they are the future. In that moment when the Taliban regime established in my country, I didn't have chance to go to school and get the opportunity to study. So I didn't know what to do. I know it was forbidden. I know it was dangerous, but I decided to dress up as a man and provide some food for my family and go to school. I thought it is one day solution. Tomorrow the things will gonna change. Tomorrow again I will be Nadia and I will follow my dream and I will get education. The day of tomorrow lasts 10 years. So during 10 years, I was dressing as a man, working and supporting my family, but I had no chance to go to school. I was very frustrated with that story. Every day, the day was passing and I had no chance to go to school. Everywhere I was going, they were saying, "You're a poor." I was not poor before of that bomb. I was a normal child like any other child. My father was working in a health ministry, my mother, my brother, but everything changed with that bomb. I lost my brother during the civil war in Afghanistan. He was robbed and killed. My father became with mental issues. So in my case, during that time, I was dressing as a man and working. I was suffering a lot, and I tried to do something for my family and all these things. I started to go to school with a lot of difficulties. I started to study. And with a lot of difficulties, I arrived to Spain. I explain my story because in Afghanistan, the terrorism, the people who are manipulating, they are only manipulating innocent children, like me. They saw my frustration. And one day, the other boys told me, there is a good people, they are taking you to a madrasa, and they were supporting your family in order, if you kill yourself, by the name of God. I was very happy with this question. I wanted to die because I had no hope. I lost all my hope. So one day, this man was teaching me how to do the things, and I was lucky because a imam of the mosque saved me from that man. But for me, it was like, I put the name of that man, good man, nice man. He's listening to me. What we need, the young generation, what they need, someone to listen to them, someone to give them opportunities. So for this reason, once I arrived in Spain, I founded Bridges for Peace. In Catalan is Ponts per la Pau. I created this organization in order to help other Nadias to go to school and have opportunity, not in a tent, in normal school as your children are going. Please, ladies and gentlemen, please support refugee children, young boys that they are waiting in the borders and they only have one dream. They want to go to school, university. If you want to help, thank you. If you want to help us, please open the university and schools for refugees and for Afghan girls and boys. Otherwise they will fill in the hand of the terrorism, and they will become manipulated, and they will be future terrorism. If you want to help them, please open the schools. In the refugee camp in Greece, there is 1,000 boys. Just do a survey and ask them what you want. They will ask you, I want education. I want future for my children. So education is the key to prevent all type of crimes. That education is the way that we can help and support other children that they are coming, and this is the only solution. Do not spend the money creating borders. Do not spend the money creating weapons. Please, only the way is education, and open the universities and a school for these children, because we need. And Bridges for Peace always dream to put a light in my country. Even now we are in the darkness and we are suffering a lot without hope, without anything. But my hope is that Bridges for Peace will make this light in my country. And I'm asking you, ladies and gentlemen, please ask your universities, your school, to give us opportunity to join a school without bureaucratic ways, without any bureaucratic, because we don't have chance to make a lot of paper to join a school or university, to make us easy to go and follow our dream. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your strong statement and your message. Open schools, open universities, give young people the chance for education. We will have later the chance to respond to your statement. Thank you very much again for your work you are doing yourself for victims of terrorism as a victim. And now we have the chance to listen to someone who is now member of Parliament of the National Assembly of Kenya, Mr. Abdi Yusuf Hassan. And he is also a victim of a terrific terrorist attack. But please, tell it us yourself. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I was greatly moved by the presentation of the previous speaker, who I greatly sympathize with, having myself worked in Afghanistan as a UN official in the last 20 years ago. So I really underpin the importance of education, educating the children and the people who are at the receiving end. I'd like to speak on my own experience. My name is Yusuf Hassan. I'm a member of parliament, a third-term member of parliament in the Kenya National Assembly. I'm elected from a constituency in the capital city, Nairobi, quite a mixed neighborhood, which has got a lot of slums as well as a marginalized section of the urban population. I would say the number of violence groups using terror tactics targeting civilians in Africa has considerably increased in the last 10 years. Organized terror groups have active presence in over a dozen African countries, from Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Nigeria in the west, to Somalia and Kenya in the east. And recently we have been joined by Mozambique in southern Africa. Highly organized terror groups such as Boko Haram in West Africa to Al-Shabaab in the Horn of Africa are wreaking havoc, violently and discriminately targeting civilians on a daily basis. Whereas in 2015, terror groups carried out about 380 attacks, killing 1,394 people in Africa, by 2020, that number had sharply risen to more than 7,000 attacks, resulting in over 12,500 deaths. Behind these bare statistics are ordinary human beings like you and me, women, men, and children. Every attack takes away a father, a mother, a husband, a wife, a brother, a sister. It leaves behind a widow and a widower, a bereaved and devastated family and community. It also maims and cripples thousands of others, most probably the breadwinner of that particular family, a productive and a valued member of that family, leaving behind unbearable social, economic burden on his or her dependent family and the community at large. While there are considerable resources allocated to the hardware aspects of countering terrorism, on the whole, little has been paid to what I could call the software aspects of this particular problem. And that's the area of support for the victims of terrorism from individuals who have been permanently disabled to families who have lost their breadwinners, left with children without a fallback system or a safety net in place. Mitigating the social and economic consequences of terror conflicts, and communities that have been left devastated, their livelihoods destroyed, displaced by the violence. As we've had, whenever a violent extremists attack, people flee. They become refugees, either in their own countries as displaced people or as refugees in neighboring countries. We in Kenya do not feel the victims and the countries at the receiving end of terrorism have received the urgent and necessary attention they need. Little effort has been put in supporting victims of terrorism, and more needs to be done. And I speak from a personal experience. The peace and tranquility of my home city of Nairobi and my neighborhood of Kamkunji, this is the neighborhood that I represent in Parliament and where I was born and I grew up, was shattered by the horrors of terrorism and violent extremism in 2011. A spate of attacks was unleashed on the people of Nairobi and the area I come from. And on the 7th of December 2012, I became a victim when I was violently attacked and seriously injured in my constituency, where 8 people were killed, including 2 children, one 10-year-old and 12 years old, brothers who were standing behind me, and over 30 people injured, many of them amputees, several of them double amputees. One of them was a medical student at our local university. I was in a wheelchair for 2 years, and I walked with the support of crutches for another year. At that time, doctors said I would never be able to walk again, and I do need to be amputated to be saved from further suffering and pain. A terrible misfortune we thought until then only happened to others, to strangers, was happening to us, to people we knew, and to our neighbors. What was hitherto a distant problem often seen on television screen was now on our door. Between 2011 and 2014, we experienced a wave of violent attacks in which hundreds of people were killed and many others were injured. We faced these daunting challenges in the best way we could, and we rallied our community to counter the ideology of the terrorist groups and support the victims. And I must say that we have been very successful in rolling back radicalization, in dealing with our youth to be able to move on to. In my own constituency, I have built centers where we have started to train people in ICT, in other technologies and abilities to be able to give them the support that they need to be able to get into the market. We've built technical colleges. At the beginning, when I went back and I was elected, I thought perhaps taking kids to university was the best way to do it. But in this inner city area with a lot of problems, many of these kids had dropped in the primary stages of their education or in their secondary school and simply did not have the capacity or the ability to continue at a university level. So they needed basic education. And that's what I think is important, is that many of the young people who join radicalization are people who have dropped out of the system, people who have not been able to make it and need to be supported to be able to come back into the system, to get the tools that would allow them to work and be productive citizens in their communities. We've also been able to reduce negative influence and the impact of the radicalizers. But the long-term consequences of violence extremism has become a major challenge. It is something that cannot be changed very quickly unless we get a lot of support for the victims and the communities in which they come from. The circumstances of victims of terrorism differ from one place to the other, from one context to the other. And the African Union member states are not at all at the same level of development. There are some who can support their communities, there are others who are struggling. Some members have more capacity to respond to the situation than others. In most African countries, there are no legislations that can be cited for compensating victims of terror. Equally, there's no legal tradition that can be cited as an act as a framework to offering litigation to help victims. The first problem that I noticed in my own particular case and in my community was the crippling cost of medical. Medicine is very expensive, and many of these poor communities are simply not able to cope with the advanced medical treatment that you need. In my particular case, I had to undergo quite a lengthy process of rebuilding, reconstruction, and time, and not many people can simply have the time and energy. And I was injured at an election time, and a lot of people thought that I would drop out of the election. But fortunately, with the support of my community, I was elected when I was bedridden in hospital, with a very big majority, which was an expression of the public in rejection of the acts of terrorism. When it comes to the issue of victims of terrorism, we recognize that while victims pay the highest price in terms of bearing the brunt of a terrorist activity, the victims of terrorism are quite often forgotten, and their needs almost completely neglected. I deal with a lot of people who come to me because the kids of the victim who has been killed do not have the capacity, support to go to school, for example. And they need, particularly if it is a big family, going to school, the cost of education is crippling for that family. The circumstances of victims of terrorism differ, as I said, from one place to another. However, in the case of Kenya, we have passed Section 49 of the Prevention of the Terrorism Act of 2012, provides for the following: that there should be a fund to be known as the Compensation of Victims of Terrorism Fund. Section 49 also mandates that the Cabinet Secretary in the government responsible for matters relating to regulations, to pass regulations that provide for the management and administration of that fund and to anything that is connected with it. So we're working to make sure that that fund is up and running and is well resourced to be able to support the victims. But it is something that has taken time and effort to be able to be put into place. So I would say, in conclusion, that in Africa, victims are not compensated, since there's no adequate legal procedures that could examine and help the victims affected. And I'll say that national parliaments have a role to play in this key effort to ratify the relevant international instruments and also to take responsibility to ensure that supporting terrorism victims go hand in hand with respect to the values shared by the overwhelming majority of the international community: human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law. I would also say that, given the time, I can mention this in the discussions. In conclusion, I'll say compensations of victims of terrorism, the families, is important in any counter-terrorism strategy. And I think institutions and organizations that work in that particular area must put that as a priority. I see that the Council of Europe Guidelines on Human Rights and the Fight Against Terrorism recognizes the state has the obligation to provide adequate compensation to the victims of terrorism. And in particular, it emphasizes the fact that as a result, the confiscation of the property of the perpetrators. This is something that is not done. Terrorism constitutes a multifaceted threat to international, regional, national peace, security, and stability, and remains unequivocally unacceptable, irrespective of its motivations, objectives, origins, forms, and manifestation. We need equity and justice for all, and especially the victims and the survivors. We must not have double standards, be selective or tactical in our approach to terrorism. If we're really serious, we must approach and address counter-terrorism and violence extremism in a selfless, holistic manner. That is why we must not see ourselves as the global North, the global South, Middle East, or Africa, but as one global community, united in facing the threat of terrorism and violent extremism as one world, one community. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Abdi Yusuf Hassan, for your statement and putting the focus on Africa, because sometimes we only see some countries, but it's a widespread phenomenon. And we as parliamentarians and as IPU, I think it is our duty to do everything to implement by legislation support for victims of terrorism. And in many countries, as you mentioned it, they are forgotten and they have no support. So it is important having politicians like you with this personal experience and to impact those words among colleagues as you did it today. Now we have a second video with a personal song and photos from another virtual guest who can't be here today. Her name is Falamata Bunu, a young girl who was kidnapped by the Boko Haram when she was only 12 years old. When she learned that Boko Haram would use her for a suicide mission, she took the chance to escape. And she ran for several days until she arrived at her village.
Hello everybody. In the beginning, I want to share my little greeting to you people of this forum. I was victims of terrorism and now I am a survivor. The reason why I become a survivor, I was facing many challenges from many people here in our camp. So now I can say the challenges is lower, but still I'm facing a challenge, even a little. So Alhamdulillah, I can say Alhamdulillah for everything, and I would to share my thankful for you. Thank you for your time and your supported me. So after that, I have a swimming machine that I want to show you how I'm making a dressings for my friends. Oh, so here is my camp. Here is where I'm living with my family and enjoy my life with my friends and family. So here is my camp. How is my camp? Come. So here is how my camp is. Here I'm living, and I'm living in one of the many. So here is my swimming machine, and also I'm making someone dressing my friend's dressing. So here is the owner of this dressing. So now I will make it, and also I have tumblers. Here is my swimming machine. So bye bye. Thank you for everything.
Thank you. Yeah, I say thank you to the virtual statements, but also to our two guests who are here today with us. And finally, it is an honor for me to announce Ms. Pramila Patten, the newly elected officer in charge of UN Women. Thank you for your participation in our session. And as we know, women are more affected, women and girls especially, are more affected from violence and from terrorist attacks. And so it is a pleasure for us having you here and waiting for your statement.
Thank you, Thank you, Excellency. Good morning to everyone. Distinguished speakers of national assemblies from around the world, distinguished panelists, I want you to join me in reassuring Nadia that her appeal will not go into deaf ears. For my part, I will amplify her voice within the Security Council, the United Nations. On Monday, the Secretary General will be launching an urgent humanitarian appeal on Afghanistan, and UN Women will be there, and I can assure you, Nadia, that your message will be amplified. And I have no doubt that all of us here, we stand in solidarity with you, with the people of Afghanistan, but more especially the women and the girls. I am extremely grateful for this opportunity to address you at this first global summit on counter-terrorism about an issue which is not often spoken about: sexual violence as a tactic of terrorism. Sexual violence is today being increasingly used as a tactic of terrorism, from Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, in the Middle East, to Somalia, Nigeria, and Mali in Africa, amongst other places. I think it's very critical for you parliamentarians, in your effort to support victims of terrorism, to understand the importance of addressing violence against women as an integrated part in countering and preventing violent extremism efforts and discourse. This summit is also timely as COVID-19 alters perceptions of safety and security for millions of women and girls in social isolation. The pandemic poses a significant threat to the maintenance of peace and security, with international, regional, and national conflict resolution efforts and peace processes stalled on the one hand, as the world responds to COVID-19, and on the other hand, terrorist groups seeing a window of opportunity to strike while the attention of most governments is turned towards the pandemic. Sexual violence is not an inevitable consequence of conflict, but a systematic and strategic tactic of war. The same litany of horrors are recounted by Yazidi women held captive by Daesh extremists in Iraq, by girls who fled from Boko Haram, by Somali women liberated from the Al-Shabaab extremist group, and by women living under Al-Qaeda-linked militants in northern Mali. I really commend the organizers for shining the spotlight on sexual violence in conflict and its systematic use by terrorist groups, because until recently, it has been very much ignored in discussions around countering terrorism. Despite extensive documentation of its strategic use, sexual violence has largely been framed as an issue of protection of civilians, and it has accordingly merely been an afterthought in all counter-terrorism initiatives. Since taking office as the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, I have focused on many countries where conflict-related sexual violence has been used as a tactic of terrorism: Iraq, Nigeria, Somalia, and Mali, among other countries. And I still recall the stories of unimaginable sexual violence against women and girls, sexual slavery, forced marriage, kidnapping, rape, and other atrocities perpetrated by extremist actors in Al-Shabaab-controlled regions of Somalia. The stories of the Yazidi women I met in the IDP camp in Mosul, Iraq, remain indelible to me, and they are the same stories that shocked the conscience of the world. These women were reduced to slavery, sold in markets to members of ISIL based on age or perceived beauty, and raped and traded multiple times. I saw the very documents that turned these women from individuals into property. In Maiduguri, northeast Nigeria, in the crowded conditions of displaced person camps, I met with hundreds of very young women and girls who had been released from captivity of Boko Haram, with tiny babies on their laps that were the result of their rapes by Boko Haram fighters. And these women were hit by the double tragedy of rape and rejection by their own families and communities. The modus operandi of these terrorist groups depict how rape and other forms of sexual violence have become part of the political economy of terrorism, with women and girls becoming expendable currency. Terrorists raid, pillage, abduct, extort, ransom, trade, and traffic to supplement their personal microeconomies, while women suffer structural discrimination at the macroeconomic level, which reduces their resilience to financial and security shocks. Terrorists use rape, sexual slavery, and other forms of sexual violence to recruit new fighters, to terrorize communities into compliance and displace them from strategic areas, to torture and extract intelligence, to compel conversion and indoctrination through forced marriage, and to generate revenue through sex trafficking, slave trade, and ransoms. They use sexual violence because it is cheap and effective at displacing thousands of individuals from territory they seek to control, to change the demographic makeup of communities, and to humiliate and punish their adversaries. Rape is also a silent weapon. Few survivors speak out about it, and accordingly, impunity prevails for perpetrators. My message to you this morning is that addressing sexual violence is not only a question of protection. It is absolutely critical for you to understand and recognize the ways in which sexual violence supports and sustains terrorist groups, and why combating sexual violence should be a central part of effective counter-terrorism response. For parliaments to better shape prevention and response efforts and support survivors, it is important for you to understand the strategic benefits of using sexual violence and why sexual violence needs to be conceptualized as a strategy of terror and destruction rather than an isolated act related to the war zone. Parliaments can play a critical role in shaping both prevention and response efforts to sexual violence, 1, through legislation, 2, oversight processes, 3, budget allocation, and 4, advocacy. But I will focus my intervention on legislation. By working to combat sexual violence, you can seriously undermine one of the most effective destabilizing strategies of terrorist and extremist organizations. As ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and other terrorist actors systematically use women's bodies in their efforts to spread fear and destabilize societies, you need to craft more nuanced responses that both address the impacts of sexual violence on women and communities and undercut the benefits accrued by terrorist groups. Although over the past decades, many states have indeed adopted or improved legislation to prevent and respond to sexual violence in conflict, significant gaps in legal frameworks exist and are most apparent in contexts where sexual violence has been committed by terrorist groups. Sometimes national legal frameworks and social norms can even exacerbate these problems, as for example in Afghanistan, where victims of sexual violence can be prosecuted for moral crimes and are at risk of murder through so-called honor killings. You can and must address the multiple gaps in legislative frameworks because robust laws are necessary not only to punish perpetrators of sexual violence, but also to prevent new crimes and send a strong signal to would-be perpetrators that it is no longer cost-free to commit such crimes. Ending impunity by prosecuting sexual crimes is another critical step. Did you know that not a single Islamic State militant has faced trial in Iraq for sexual violence crimes against the Yazidi? And the same goes for crimes committed by Boko Haram in Nigeria. My office has recently published a model legislative guidance and provisions on the investigation and prosecution of conflict-related sexual violence, a practical tool that is intended to allow member states to build and bolster accountability frameworks at the national level. The legislative guidance sets out crimes such as sexual violence as an act of genocide and sexual violence as an act of terrorism, reflecting the most advanced standards. This tool was prepared with survivors and is about and for survivors. The tool contains all the elements that are truly needed to prosecute these crimes and empower the victims. In addressing legislative gaps, parliaments must also ensure that laws adopted are survivor-centered, that they recognize survivors as rights holders who deserve respect, in addition to physical and legal protection, holistic medical and psychosocial support, reintegration and rehabilitation services, as well as restitution. Too often, victims of sexual violence by terrorist groups are seen as accomplices, affiliates, or intelligent assets. They are arrested, interrogated, and detained. So it is critical that survivors of sexual violence are recognized as legitimate victims of conflict and terrorism who are entitled to relief, reparations, and equality before the law. The guidance ensures that the justice system will not only do no harm, but will actually do it right. Victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence have been disempowered by perpetrators. Therefore, putting them in the driver's seat in the justice process puts the power back into their hands where it belongs. Victims and survivors deserve justice close to home, justice which involves and includes them, justice which empowers rather than sacrifices them, justice which honors their courage and respects their constraints, justice which considers their needs as a core consideration rather than an afterthought, justice which uplifts them rather than further victimizes them, justice which paves the way for other victims to come forward, justice which is accessible, tangible, visible, and transformative. I am deeply convinced of the potential that parliamentary action can bring to this agenda of countering terrorism, Adoption of these model legislative provisions by parliamentarians in national jurisdiction can be a meaningful step towards fulfillment of the priorities set out in the framework of cooperation which I signed with the IPU last June, in particular the commitment to promote the adoption, review, and implementation of national legislation to promote and protect persons affected by or at risk of conflict-related sexual violence used as a tactic of terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pramila Patten, United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict and Acting Executive Director of UN Women, one of the important organizations within UN. And now we have two more speakers, also from UN, David Elamos from UN OCT, and our colleague Nikolai West. I will hand over to both of the colleagues. Please do it in the shortest way as it is possible, because we are running out of time. I have to be such unpolite. Sorry.
Well received. Thank you very much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is really an honor to share this session with this distinguished panel, and of course to listen to Nadia and to Abdi Yusuf Hassan, and also to our virtual guest. And we receive the messages. We will work hard even to respond better to these messages. It is an honor, and I'm pleased also to be speaking today during this important session of victims of terrorism, and to co-present the joint project that we are doing together with our partner, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and the Inter-Parliamentary Union, on the development of the model legislative provision on victims of terrorism. I would like also to thank them, and starting to say that over the last several years, the international community has made real progress on upholding the right of victims and the support for the needs of victims of terrorism through the adoption of key General Assembly resolution by providing victims with a greater platform to share their stories, and by placing victims at the center of the counter-terrorism efforts. The Secretary General's report on victims, as well as the 2019 General Assembly Resolution 73305 and the 7th Review Resolution for the implementation of the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, which was adopted last June of this year, have continued to urge member states, but also the United Nations, to strengthen its efforts to support victims, whether it is from solidarity to advocacy or to more practical measures like, for example, technical assistance and capacity building. The Secretary General's report particularly highlights the need for member states to develop model legislation, lesson learned, good practices, specifically for victims, considering precisely the rights and the needs that come up as a result of a terrorist attack. The General Assembly resolution emphasizes also the key role of the United Nations that can play in this regard. This call has been received, and we are in UNOCT very proud to be partners under the tripartite UN and IPU initiative to develop the model legislative provision for victims of terrorism. As the world rapidly changes and as we see a fluid terrorist landscape, we also see the threat of creating new victims. It remains important, therefore, that the efforts undertaken at the international level must be also translated at the national and regional level to avoid losing the progress achieved so far. And therefore, it is very important also to develop and to count with strong domestic legal frameworks, which is the only way in which rights and needs of victims can be truly realized. The purpose of the model legislative provision seeks to guide member states in understanding the key issues that affect victims, whether it is from compensation or maybe from assistance and support or access to justice. Having this knowledge and also developing the right tools will effectively help states to properly implement a specific provision or strengthen existing one that uphold the right and the support the needs of the victims. The provision, which will include also a gender-sensitive component, will seek to serve as a model to review the existing laws and procedures of victims of terrorism in line with recent advances on this subject matter, and to strengthen these frameworks where required. But it will also seek to support development of legislation to better support victims where no legislation exists. Ultimately, the provisions act as a fundamental basis to strengthen the national response, specifically assist and support victims of terrorism through a legal framework that puts victims at its heart. The provision will be also tailored to the national needs in line with the constitutional principles and legal tradition of each member states, and after carefully review the existing legislative framework. Thus, we hope that through these efforts, the provision will also serve as a catalyst to systematize and promote the exchange of information regarding existing good practices between member states, and also to promote and to strengthen the collaboration among countries, the UN, civil society, and victims. This model legislative provision will also elaborate under the scope of the Parliamentary Engagement Program as regards UNOCT, to which our Undersecretary General spoke and referred this morning. We would like here also to extend the invitation to all of you to extend our partnerships and collaboration with the Parliamentary Engagement Program in any of the fields that we are currently working. It is indeed the unique UN Global Office completely devoted to support and enhance the work of parliamentarians and parliamentary assemblies in preventing the scourge of terrorism by implementing the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, United Nations Security Council resolution, as well as other international instruments. This new program office, based in Doha, will continue strengthening parliamentary contribution and facilitate interparliamentary dialogue on counter-terrorism and preventing violent extremism, building upon core parliamentary functions and partnership with parliamentary assemblies. I would like to finish by taking the opportunity to thank once again UNODC and IPU for this important partnership, but also other entities in the UN family, victims association, and victims who are working closely with us to enhance that the model legislative provision on victims of terrorism truly reflect the rights and the needs of victims worldwide. Many thanks for your attention.
Also for the time discipline, please.
Excellence, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. With David Alamos, I'm co-presenting the work on the model legislative provisions for victims of terrorism, and here I will focus on parts of the work and process so far, as well as overall aims of the provisions. And it's an honor and privilege to speak at this summit, and I can only echo the appreciation just expressed by my colleague. With the aim to develop the provisions, UNOCT, UNODC, and IPU jointly organized a virtual expert consultation session in July 2020, followed by 6 thematic expert consultation sessions from November 2020 to January 2021, which addressed a range of specific subjects. These included themes such as the right to compensation, recognition and remembrance, assistance and support for victims of terrorism, including rehabilitation, protection of privacy and dignity of victims of terrorism, the role of victims associations and non-governmental organizations, and access to justice for victims of terrorism. In the work of developing the model legislative provisions, it has been a priority to have an inclusive process with broad consultations, ensuring a wide expertise. Members of Parliament, international and national experts, relevant entities of the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Coordination Compact, regional parliamentary organizations, academia, civil society, associations of victims of terrorism, and victims themselves participated in the expert consultations. The subsequent drafting, which is still ongoing, has taken place under the trilateral program. Furthermore, feedback on the draft model provisions have been sought from a core group of experts, including experts from key UN entities, academia, and civil society. The provisions aim to be a technical assistance tool. The purpose of developing the provisions, which has also been addressed by my colleague, includes that the provisions may serve as a model for the review of existing laws and procedures related to victims of terrorism and advance good practices. Additionally, the development of model legislative provisions can serve to draw attention to the urgency of taking concrete steps to protect, assist, and support victims of terrorism. This should be seen within the overall aim to strengthen the capacity of national parliaments. It should be highlighted that the model provisions are not intended to replace the national legislative drafting process and be incorporated directly into national legislation. Rather, the model legislative provisions will propose a basis to assist in strengthening the national response, to be tailored to the national needs, as also mentioned by my colleague, in line with the constitutional principles and legal traditions of each member state. In short, the provisions will represent a resource for member states to bring national legislation in line with international norms through a victim-centered approach. An approach which should actively engage victims to fully understand the harms suffered and their rights and needs, and enable them to play active and participatory roles in measures to support and assist them without fear of stigma, reprisals, or secondary victimization. UNODC has contributed to the development and concrete drafting of the provisions. This was done by building on UNODC's long-standing experience in providing legislative technical assistance to parliamentarians and drawing on UNODC's integrated mandates on prevention of crime, corruption, and terrorism in all their manifestations. In the area of counter-terrorism legislation alone, UNODC has supported the drafting, revision, and adoption of 189 pieces of legislation, including in cooperation with parliament members of IPU. In the area of victims of terrorism, UNODC has developed a range of publications addressing the rights and needs of victims of terrorism, and also has a strong mandate related to victims of crime in general, including as the custodian of the UN Declaration of Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power. Looking ahead, UNODC's recently adopted strategy for 2021 to 25 highlights that UNODC will expand the on-the-ground presence to ensure that member states can respond to emerging issues as they relate to terrorism and provide support to victims. In conclusion, allow me to thank the IPU and UNOCT for fruitful cooperation on this very important initiative. A special acknowledgement and thanks must be extended to the IPU's Secretariat in Geneva under the leadership of Ambassador Omar Mokhtar for supporting this partnership. Also, heartfelt thanks go to other entities of the UN family, experts, victims' organizations, and victims themselves for the invaluable contributions to the work on developing the provisions. We are confident that the model legislative provisions will be an important tool to support parliamentarians in delivering on their commitments to protect rights of victims of terrorism. Thank you.
For this presentation of model legislative provisions for victims of terrorism. Now we have around 40 minutes for a discussion, and before we start with the discussion, I have to tell you that I intervene sharply after 3 minutes. I want to be fair to everyone, so please have in mind 3 minutes for each intervention. The first one is a senator from Pakistan, Mr. Raza Rabbani. Senator Rabbani, the floor is yours. Where is Senator?
I'm here, Chair.
Okay, please, Senator.
Thank you, Chair. I'm grateful. The basic purpose of my intervention today is essentially on the book that I have written on the victims of terrorism, essentially children, and by the name of Smile Snatchers. The exact purpose of writing this book is to highlight the victims of terrorism and to bring to the fore for the international community to realize that that we are dealing with a new generation which will be coming into existence with a lot of issues and problems because they have been victims of terrorism. They have seen sexual abuse of their families, and they have seen people dying in front of them. But having said that about the book, I would just very quickly like to just talk about what is before us today. And pardon me if I sound a little critical on the issue, but I think that what we have been talking about today is essentially patchwork, and we have not really talked about the basic cause and the basic question of how terrorism can be eradicated. And I think that when we are talking about the eradication of terrorism, what we fail to take into consideration is that the massive military-industrial complex which is prevalent in the world, the manner in which developing countries and nations are manipulated, and terrorism is to an extent fostered to meet certain strategic interests of superpowers and to take forward a particular political agenda. In this, what can Parliament do? I think in national parliaments have a very limited role. If today we believe that we can get rid of terrorism by bringing about legislation, then I think that we are being rather navy about it. Yes, to a certain extent, it can be controlled, but the cause of getting rid of it cannot come about by simply legislating. It is a question of changing perceptions. It is a question of realizing that we are being used by certain vested interests. And just finally, I know my 3 minutes are over, but just finally, the basic question on which the Afghan lady spoke about opening schools and universities, that would only be possible if we go down to the root and look for the eradication of terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Our next speaker is Ms. Shahiba Gafarova, Speaker of the Milli Mejlis of Republic of Azerbaijan, and then Mr. Sultan Sayed Al-Bakani, Speaker of the House of Representatives of the Republic of Yemen. Please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, following the tragic events of 9/11, the states were mostly concerned with the prevention and the combating terrorism, which poses a more serious threat to international peace and security and gross violation of basic human rights. The international community, in parallel with countering terrorism as a security threat at current stage, has to take fully into account the rights of victims of terrorism, which implicitly recognizes the international instruments adopted in the framework of the United Nations, is one of the key elements of effective counter-terrorism measures. States should ensure adequate support to victims of terrorism and their families as they suffer from heinous crime. Parliaments playing a vital role in establishing effective mechanisms for providing to victims of terrorism the best possible assistance and support should elaborate inclusive legislation which establishes cooperation between government, civil society organizations, media, and private sector in addressing this multidimensional issue. Relevant law and policies on the support of victims must reflect the principles and commitments enshrined in the United Nations Strategy on Global Counter-Terrorism and Resolution on enhancement of international cooperation to assist victims of terrorism. Considering the fact that no country is immune to the threat of terrorism, relevant legal and institutional measures on supporting the victims of terrorism should be adopted in all states. My country, Azerbaijan, has been consistent in its support to combating terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, including addressing the phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters, financing of terrorism, and addressing the linkage between terrorism, violence, separatism, and extremism, and other illicit activities. Last year's 44 Patriotic War of Azerbaijan clearly demonstrated the linkage between the violent separatism, terrorism, and extremism which was actively used by Armenia against Azerbaijan. Dear participants, in conclusion, I'd like to mention that considering the special circumstances surrounding victims of terror acts against Azerbaijan, in our country there is an extensive and continuous governmental and non-governmental assistance to victims to address their needs. This policy in Azerbaijan is focused on the facilitation of the rapid normalization of the lives of victims of terrorism and their families. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, dear speaker. Our next speaker is Mr. Sultan Said Al-Bakani, Speaker of the House of Representatives of the Republic of Yemen, and then Esperanza Payas, Speaker of the Parliament of Mozambique.
السيد الرئيس، السيدات والسادة، إن تطوير نظام مكافحة الإرهاب مهمة شاقة، وقد انتهجت دول كثيرة استراتيجيات فاعلة بحيث اشتملت إجراءات تجفيف المنابع مجالات أمنية واستخباراتية ومالية، وامتدت لافتتاح مراكز المناصحة والحوار بما في ذلك على منصات التواصل الاجتماعي لأجل تخفيف آثار التطرف على المتلقين، وقد أدى ذلك إلى إحراز نتائج ملموسة تمثلت في تحجيم المنظمات الإرهابية وتقليص نشاطها، لكن الإرهاب تمكن من تخليق استراتيجيات للتكيف مع تلك الإجراءات، وعبر عن نفسه ضمن تجليات إيديولوجية ومعتقدات مختلفة. إن الإرهاب بشكله المعاصر توسعت آفاقه لتتنوع غاياته السياسية وأهدافه الاقتصادية والفكرية والاجتماعية والطائفية والقومية والمتطرفة والعنصرية العرقية والتشدد الديني التي لا تسمح بالتعايش وقبول الآخر، تعد مصادر للإرهاب، وباستيعاب العواقب الكارثية للتطرف العنيف على المجتمعات يأتي دور البرلمانيين. ولكني هنا أناشدكم كزميل لكم وبلدي تواجه إرهابا بشعا تمارسه جماعة الحوثي الإرهابية وملالي إيران وأفكارهم الطارئة علينا وعلى شعبهم، تقتل الإنسان وتهدم البناء وتدمر الحياة. وها هي قد أصدرت أحكاما بالإعدام على 46 نائبا برلمانيا. نخشى أن تصدر فتوى منفلتة فيقتلون حيث يتواجدون داخل اليمن أو خارجها. وقد صادرت ممتلكاتهم وأهلكت الحرث والنسل، فضلا عن تجنيد الأطفال وحرمان النساء من جميع الممارسات السياسية والحقوق، ووصلت إلى حد فرض أزياء الملابس عليهن إنني هنا أتوجه بنداء إليكم ومناشدة أن تقفوا إلى جانب زملائكم لإنقاذ حياتهم بالوسائل التي ترونها ممكنة، لأن حياتهم في خطر. كما أننا نعود إلى الموضوع الأصلي الذي نتحدث عنه، وهو ما يستلزم الأمر تكامل الجهود من خلال اتباع مناهج علمية في التعليم تراعي مقتضيات المجتمعات المحلية وتنوعها الثقافي والفكري، والعمل مع المؤسسات الفكرية الأكاديمية ومؤسسات المجتمع المدني لإعادة تقييم المناهج التعليمية في المدارس وتجفيف المنابع الأولية التي يتلقاها النشء، وبما يعزز ترسيخ مبادئ المواطنة والعدالة الاجتماعية، ويدعم حماية الحقوق والحريات العامة ونبذ العنف والتطرف بكافة أشكاله. إن تبني البرلمانات تنشيط دور الأسرة ومشاركة المرأة في هذه العملية لما لها من حضور مؤثرا في تشكيل وجدان الأبناء والشباب وتحصينهم من الانجراف نحو العنف ووعي الكراهية واعتمادها كشريك أساسي في الاستراتيجيات الوطنية لمكافحة الإرهاب، أمرا في غاية الأهمية، ومواجهة التطرف والعنف. تبني البرلمانات تشريعات تأخذ في الاعتبار أن الإرهاب ليس لونا واحدا وليس دينا بعينه، وإنما كل إرادة تعتمد على الغلبة والقوة والعنف والفرض على مساراتها على الغير. إن تبني البرلمانات استراتيجية تمكين الخطاب الديني الوسطي المعتدل ونشر مفاهيم الحقوق والحريات العامة وإعلائها، والعمل على تعديل التشريعات القائمة لمواجهة أوجه القصور في الإجراءات الحالية من أجل الوصول لمنهجية أكثر فاعلية. لا تكتفي البرلمانات بدور التشريع بعيدا عن متابعة السلطات التنفيذية وإلزامها بتوفير الفرص الاقتصادية مما يكفل تحسين مستوى معيشة المجتمع وانخراط الشباب في الإنتاج وحصولهم على فرص إدارة الدخل، وأن تشكل لجان.
Sorry, this is not fair what you are doing. So please come to an end. Speaker of Yemen.
بدورة التشريع بعيدا عن متابعة السلطات التنفيذية وإلزامها بتوفير الفرص الاقتصادية. إنني هنا أكرر سيد الرئيس والسادة الزملاء دعوتي الملحة والمخلصة لكم أن تضعوا موضوع حكم الإعدام على زملائكم قضية الرئيسية في هذه الجلسة، وتعد عملا إرهابيا واضحا وجليا لا يقبل اللبس، لأن أمر كهذا لا أعتقد أنكم ستقبلونه أو تتجاوزونه وتتركون بلدا يعيش مأساة إنسانية وزملائكم البرلمانيين في حياتهم في خطر. وشكرا لكم والله أكبر.
Thank you. I have to ask everyone really to be in time. The next one is the Speaker of the Parliament of Mozambique, Esperanza Baez, and then the Chairperson of the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the Turkish Parliament, Mr. Akif Sakatay Kilic. Please, Speaker of the Parliament of Mozambique.
Muito obrigada, Sr. Presidente. Este tema em debate mostra-se pertinente para o meu país, Moçambique, que tem sido alvo de ataques terroristas que já resultaram na morte de mais de 2.000 cidadãos indefesos, raptos, principalmente de mulheres e crianças, destruição e vandalização de infraestruturas públicas e privadas e a deslocação de mais de 850.000 pessoas das suas zonas de origem e de produção. A situação humanitária em Cabo Delgado é preocupante e tem exigido do governo, do Parlamento, autoridades religiosas, organizações da sociedade civil e singulares, esforços tremendos para apoio aos que tudo perderam e os que sofrem de traumas psicológicos por terem presenciado atos horrendos cometidos contra os seus familiares e próximos. A Assembleia da República, ciente da situação das vítimas e no quadro do regimento interno, mandatou uma comissão de assuntos constitucionais, direitos humanos e legalidade para deslocar-se aos locais afetados e averiguar a situação dos direitos humanos. Como resultado, aprovou uma resolução condenando e repudiando os ataques terroristas, recomendando ao governo a tomada de ações com vista a garantir o mínimo de condições básicas para as pessoas deslocadas. A Assembleia tem igualmente feito visitas para aferir o grau de implementação das recomendações deixadas pelo governo e auscultar as questões que os deslocados enfrentam. O terrorismo é um fenómeno que exige cooperação regional e internacional. E é dentro deste quadro que gostaríamos de agradecer o apoio que nos tem sido dado pela Força Alerta da SADC, do Ruanda e todos os outros países que se preocupam com Moçambique. Há ainda muito por dizer, mas gostaria de terminar e dizer que contamos ainda com o apoio de todos para as vítimas destes ataques horríveis. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much, dear speaker. Our next speaker is the chairperson of the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the Turkish Parliament and then the Speaker of the Parliament of Ireland, Mark Daly. Please.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, distinguished delegates, terrorism has been a great source of concern for Turkey due to the fact that it keeps victimizing people of our society, our security forces and civil servants. Turkey is fighting against several terrorist organizations, including the PKK and its Syrian branches, PYD, YPG, and also Daesh and the Fethullah Gülen terrorist organization, FETÖ. On this important occasion, I have 4 points to share with this distinguished audience to point out the difficulties that the victims of terrorism face. First, the PKK, YPD, and PYG terrorist organization is targeting civilians, in particular our citizens of Kurdish origin, by stealing from them, killing them, and also kidnapping their children. PKK is using children between the age of 15 to 20 who are kidnapped from their families. The PKK is training these children as terrorists, threatening them to kill their families if they somehow escape, making them drug addicted and using them in terrorist attacks. The families of these kidnapped children started a silent demonstration. This social movement is still underway and growing. This is spontaneous civic action which created awareness across and beyond the country. We urge all to display solidarity with these mothers in their struggle to take their children back from the PKK terrorists. In addition to that, PKK's Syrian branch, PYD and YPG, terrorist organization also victimizes the youth and children by forcing them to take arms on its behalf. Due to the Daesh attacks, Turkey has lost more than 309 lives, while more than 1,400 of our citizens were wounded. Turkey contributed significantly in eliminating Daesh threat, particularly through military operations, including through core-to-core fighting. Turkey has cleared vast areas from Daesh presence. We expect that Turkey's resolute action against terrorism will be better recognized and supported by the international community. Also, during the failed coup attempt of the terrorist organization FETÖ in 2016, Turkey lost 251 innocent civilians to the FETÖ terrorist organization, and more than 2,000 people were wounded in the streets. And the Turkish Grand National Assembly, the Turkish Parliament, which I have the honor to represent here, was itself bombed by this terrorist organization. On this framework, Turkey's laws, specifically the law on the compensation of losses resulting from terrorist acts, has been enforced since 2004. And a lot of people have been taken into civic service by this law. Last but not least, there are several Turkish NGOs supporting the victims and their families. These are widely supported by the Turkish nation and the state. To conclude, Turkey will continue its comprehensive fight against terrorism. Turkey will also continue giving utmost importance to the protection of the victims of terrorism. We need full international cooperation, but more importantly, we need genuine cooperation against terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, wherever or by whomever they are committed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chairperson of the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the Turkish Parliament. And now our next speaker is the Speaker of the Parliament of Ireland, and then the Deputy Speaker of the Council of States of India, Mr. Hari Vanch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I'd like to thank Nadia and the other for sharing their stories about their experiences. I'd like to thank the IPU and the Office of Counter-Terrorism at the United Nations for organising this event. Last month, the United Nations issued a statement expressing serious concerns about the British government's proposal that it plans to ban all prosecutions, impede investigations, and stop victims from pursuing civil claims in connection with the troubles in Northern Ireland between 1968 and 1998. Therefore, those who were killed by paramilitaries or the British security forces would have no avenue in which to seek justice. The UN experts said that this was a de facto amnesty and give blanket immunity for those grave human rights violations. In response to the British government's proposals, for the first time ever on my island, all the major political parties, those representing the Catholic community and the Protestant community, Unionists and Nationalists, Republican and Loyalists, came together to sign a document opposing the British government's proposal to give this de facto immunity. I presented a copy of that statement to the Deputy Speaker of the British Parliament during our conference yesterday. The person who organised the signing of that historic document was a man named Raymond McCord. Raymond McCord's son was a loyalist. He was taken by people he trusted to a quarry, and he was killed by having concrete blocks dropped on his head until he was unrecognisable. The person who organised his killing was a senior paramilitary officer, but he was also a paid informant of the British Security Services. And the reason that this amnesty is coming now is because there is a report about to be finalised in relation to one of the senior informers within the IRA being paid by the British Security Forces, which would identify a lot of the activities that were happening during the Troubles. Raymond McCord took that case to the police ombudswoman, and she proved for the first time ever of collusion and cooperation between terrorists and the British security forces. And I would ask the British government to make sure that legislation that is coming before their parliament now, in the next session, in the next few months, that they would not pass this legislation, because it is exactly the opposite of what this conference is proposing to do. And the victims of the troubles in Northern Ireland, but the victims of troubles all around the world, deserve the truth and deserve justice. And a country such as the United Kingdom should not be passing legislation that would prevent that from happening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Speaker Mark Dawley. Next, the Deputy Speaker of the Council of States of India, and then Mr. Amadou Ali Mega, member of the National Transitional Council from Mali.
At the outset, I would like to congratulate Austria, UN, and IPU for hosting the first Global Parliamentary Summit on Counter-Terrorism during these challenging times. The COVID-19 pandemic has once again reminded that we live in an interconnected world, and events in one part of the world impacts us all. Terrorism in all forms and manifestations constitute the most serious threat to international peace, security, and democratic institutions. A terrorist attack anywhere is an onslaught on human civilization everywhere. Victims of terrorism continue to struggle to have their voices heard and often suffer in isolation, as they are forgotten once the immediate aftermath of a terrorist attack fades. Friends, acts of terrorism not only violate the rights of individual victims, but also deeply affect the enjoyment of civic rights by their families and society as a whole. Measures aimed at addressing the needs of the victims of terrorism, therefore, should factor in the sensitivities of these vulnerable sections like women and children. It is the moral duty of we parliamentarians and governments to ensure adequate support system for victims of terrorism. To rehabilitate victims of terrorism, India has launched a scheme for providing financial assistance for the sustenance and maintenance of the families of the civilians victims of terrorist activities. We are issuing a health card to permanently incapacitated victims and the members of the family of the civilian victims killed, permanently incapacitated in terrorist attack, and continual assistance to children in the family. Friends, while assisting the victims of terrorism, we should not lose sight of the rights of the victims of terrorism. To get justice for the crimes committed against them, it's important that we must work towards readdressing deficiencies in the international efforts to ensure that the perpetrators of terrorism are brought to justice. India is among the oldest victims of multiple cross-border terrorist attacks. In fact, the very symbol of our democracy, the Indian Parliament was itself brutally attacked by terrorists on 13 December 2001. Moreover, in November 2008, Mumbai, our financial capital, suffered a dastardly attack. Friends, while some states lack the legal and operational frameworks and technical expertise needed to detect, investigate, and prosecute terrorist financial cases, there are also other states that are clearly guilty of aiding and supporting terrorism and will fully provide financial assistance and safe havens. While we must enhance the capacity of the former, the international community must collectively call out the latter and hold them accountable. Nadia's story has touched every heart. We parliamentarians should ensure that kids, women, or the future generations do not fall victims to terrorism. They certainly need education in school and universities. We, as the representatives of our people, can no longer be silent bystanders and must use international platforms to highlight our resolve to support treaties and norms that prevent terrorism. We must ensure that the funding of all terrorist activities is stopped and no justification whatever is used to shield for terrorism. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker of the Council of States from India, now our colleague from Mali, and then Mr. Hassan Karim Muta al-Shabawi, the first Deputy Speaker of the Council of Representatives coming from Iraq, but representing today the Arab Inter-Parliamentary Union. So now, Amadou Ali Meiga from Mali.
Chers officiels, je vous remercie et vous souhaite à tous et à toutes la bienvenue dans cette salle. J'aimerais introduire par vous présenter ma modeste personne, Amadou Ali, malien de naissance du Nord. Vous n'êtes pas sans savoir que le Mali est un pays du Sahel, un pays très pauvre et très vaste. Particulièrement, le terrorisme au Mali est une particularité parce que le Mali est un pays musulman. Seuls les chefs de ces groupes en savent les raisons de leur lutte. La population du Nord en souffre. Elle est stigmatisée et je ne serai pas long pour donner le reste de mon temps à mon président de l'Assemblée qui est plus expérimenté à vous définir le reste. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Avec votre accord, je voudrais saluer Nadia de l'Afghanistan et je voudrais lui dire qu'au Mali, il y a beaucoup de Nadia. Nous l'invitons à venir au Mali parce que dans le centre du Mali, il n'y a pas d'école. Dans le nord du Mali, il n'y a pas d'école. C'est des milliers d'enfants qui sont en chômage. Ce que les terroristes font, ils viennent voir les maîtres dans l'école, ils leur disent si on vous trouve ici demain, on va vous tuer. Ça veut dire simplement que toutes les écoles dans ces zones-là sont complètement fermées. Et cela va arriver également dans le reste du Mali. Pourquoi pas? Pourquoi je vous le dis? C'est simplement parce que les terroristes s'étendent sur l'ensemble du Mali. Je ne sais pas si un d'entre vous connaît le Mali. Dans la région de Caille, qui est la région qui est beaucoup plus au sud, les terroristes sont déjà là-bas. Moi, je vais attirer l'attention de cette conférence sur une chose. Il faut que vous compreniez que dans notre pays, dans mon pays, le Mali, tous les jours, c'est des milliers de personnes qui meurent. On prend l'arme comme ça, on vient trouver les gens à 4 heures du matin. On les bousille tous autant qu'ils sont. On brûle les villages. Dans le centre, il y a des villages qui n'existent plus. Dans le nord, il y a des campements qui n'existent plus. C'est pour vous dire simplement que moi, je lance un appel à la communauté internationale. Parce que si jamais vous ne prenez pas des mesures urgentes et précises contre le terrorisme international, je vous assure que l'ensemble des pays du monde est menacé. Ce sont des gens qui sont sans pardon. Ce sont des gens qui n'ont pitié de personne. Ce sont des gens qui tuent les pauvres. Ce sont des gens qui sont partout. Ce sont des kamikazes qui osent tuer toute une communauté. Donc je voudrais attirer l'attention de la conférence sur le fait qu'il faut lancer cet appel-là aux grandes puissances. Si les grandes puissances ne nous aident pas, le terrorisme va tuer le monde entier. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, our colleagues from Mali. We will discuss this issue in our last session today, so we will spend more time, especially focusing on this region. The next two speakers are coming from the Arab Inter-Parliamentary Union and then also from a parliamentary assembly, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, then Ms. Marietta Karamanli. First, the deputy speaker from the Arab Inter-Parliamentary Union coming from Iraq. Mr. Shabavi. Okay, he is not in the room. So Marietta Karamanli, member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe.
Oui, merci. Merci, mes chers collègues. Très brièvement, je voulais, au nom du Conseil de l'Europe, insister sur un travail que j'ai eu l'honneur de réaliser, un rapport sur la protection des victimes du terrorisme qui a été proposé avec des recommandations proposées et adoptées par les 47 États membres du Conseil de l'Europe. Je voulais rapidement insister sur quelques éléments. D'abord, l'analyse s'appuie sur la reconnaissance, le soutien, le lien avec la société civile, l'action au plan international. La reconnaissance, la protection, le soutien que vous avez tous ici évoqué, la lutte contre toute forme de discrimination, la justice, l'indemnisation, c'est effectivement les besoins fondamentaux de toutes les victimes d'infractions et donc du terrorisme vis-à-vis des personnes. Et c'est pour cette raison-là que les victimes doivent être facilement identifiables, reconnues formellement par la législation et les politiques et les procédures. Reconnaître les victimes, c'est aussi contribuer à valoriser un contre-discours, c'est important aussi, un contre-discours positif, affirmant que la terreur ne détruira pas les principes fondamentaux de nos démocraties, des droits humains et ceux individuels de chaque victime. Les victimes aussi doivent avoir accès à assister, à prendre part au procès, exactement aujourd'hui ce qui se passe en France avec l'ouverture du grand procès, le soutien financier également, mais aussi l'aide aux victimes de terrorisme doit être coordonnée, complète et efficace pour éviter la victimisation. Les organisations de victimes ont un rôle éminent. C'est pour ça d'ailleurs qu'il faut confronter le lien avec la société civile, intervenant dans le discours justement public et en défendant les intérêts des victimes, consolider l'action sur le plan international également. Et c'est des modifications qui ont été apportées à la liste des lignes directrices par la protection des victimes d'actes de terrorisme, arrêtées par le Conseil de l'Europe en 2017, 2018 et 2019. Et enfin, pour terminer, il ressort des observations, mieux partager les informations entre les services nationaux d'indemnisation, éviter les cas de double indemnisation, de coordonner l'assistance et de partager des bonnes pratiques d'expérience et d'expertise de chacun. Enfin, je pense que de retour sur expérience, comme le disait Irving Yalom, si on ne parle pas de l'essentiel, on ne parle de rien. Et c'est pour cela qu'il faut travailler sur l'effectivité des mesures. Merci et continuons le travail et le combat contre le terrorisme.
Thank you, Marietta. And also thank you to the work the Council of Europe is doing here. Our last speaker is the Vice Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of China, National People's Congress, Mr. Chen Guomin. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to share some of my general observations with the speakers and our panelists. I listened attentively to the remarks made by previous speakers. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attack and the 15th anniversary of the adoption of UN Global Counter-Terrorism strategy. Despite the significant progress made in international counter-terrorism cooperation, the world remained confronted with the tangible threats of terrorism. ISIS is very active in Iraq and Syria, and the withdrawal of foreign troops has led to chaos in Afghanistan, with terrorist forces such as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and East Turkestan Islamic movement waxing strong and wreaking havoc. The rise of the unilateralism and hegemonic politics has led to the politicization and instrumentalization of counterterrorism issues, fueling a vicious cycle of uncertainty, instability, and violence in all their manifestations. As we speakers gather in this summit, we should focus, 1, the new challenges posed by the COVID-19, 2, the new challenges posed by double standards in counterterrorism, 3, new challenges posed by new technologies. Terrorism is a real and present threat of confronting all of us. Working together in unity is the most powerful weapon to defeat terrorism. Facing the future, we need to, first, uphold the true multilateralism. All countries should commit themselves to defending the international system with the United Nations at its core and the international order based on international law, and support the UN in playing a coordinating role in the global fight against terrorism. Second, focus on prevention to eliminate the root cause of terrorism. To deal with terrorism, we must address both the symptoms and the root causes. We should attach importance to resolving regional conflicts through political process, reduce and eradicate poverty, and end social instability through economic and social development, and remove the breeding ground of terrorism and extremism. Third, oppose double standards and reject selective counterterrorism. Fourth, strengthen capacity building, effective response to new terrorist trend. Fifth, we support the IP initiative on the counterterrorism, and we are ready to work with all countries to address the new trends and the characteristics of terrorism, forge consensus, strengthen coordination, and promote counterterrorism cooperation in the right direction to safeguard the common future of all humanity. I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chen, for your contributions, and also thank you to all the other colleagues who took the chance to take the floor. Instead of conclusions from my side, I want to give the floor for some sentences. My colleague from Kenya, Honorable Hassan, please, if you want to add some sentences at the end, and then to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Very interesting and stimulating discussions and presentations and thoughts. I would just add in conclusion that unless we're able to deal with equity and justice and the underlying issues that relate to terrorism, we wouldn't be able to resolve it. And I think I will give an example now as we are dealing with the COVID pandemic. We face the same problem of COVID nationalism, in which countries that are able to provide vaccination are denying that opportunity to many of the developing countries like my country, Kenya. And therefore, the same way, we face terrorism. We are at the cutting edge. Al-Shabaab is on our borders. It has made many parts of our country ungovernable because of its attacks. And the general expectation is that we need to address the underlying issues, as have been emphasized by some of the speakers, investing in education, investing in development, supporting the weaker nations, just as we've had that plea from Mali, is that unless we're able to put our investment in dealing with those issues, terrorism is going to be with us for a very long time. The same as if we don't deal with the COVID pandemic by having an equitable distribution of the vaccine, it doesn't really matter whether you vaccinate your entire population in the global north. This particular pandemic is going to mutate and spread back to those countries that have already had the vaccination. So let's have equality, let's have equity, let's have fairness in the system. The same way with terrorism is that we can counter terrorism by working collectively as a world community, together as humanity. And in that way, we'll be able to dent it and be able to roll it back. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yusuf Hassan Abdi. And the last word now is on your side, Nadia Uliam.
Thank you so much. I just want to say my last words through the actual situation of Afghanistan, that is still there is women and children. Like, humanitarian cooperation shouldn't stop. If you need to cooperate and you don't know how to do, there is a lot of small NGOs that they can arrive, like people like me, that we want to connect a bridge connection between my country and my home country in Spain. There is a lot of Afghan women that they are living outside and they really want to bring a change in their country. So humanitarian action shouldn't stop, otherwise these women and children who is talked down in my country, they will suffer double. So please continue with your collaboration.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you very much for your interest, for your support. It is a begin of this work, this first Global Summit on Countering Terrorism, and I'm sure we will face a lot of obstacles, but we should continue with our work, and with the support of all the parliamentarians who are here, all the speakers, I'm optimistic that we can reach progress, even knowing that the danger is a big, big one, as our colleague from Mali mentioned it very clear. Thank you very much. Now it's lunch break until 2 o'clock.